10th, 2026 Eugene Planning Commission meeting. I'd like to call this meeting to order. My name is Jason Lear and I'm chair of the Eugene Planning Commission. To begin this evening, I'd like to call on Commissioner Beeson for the city's land acknowledgement statement.
Since time immemorial, the Kalapuya people have been the indigenous stewards to our region, building dynamic communities, maintaining balanced wildlife, and enacting sustainable land practices. This land acknowledgement is a way of resisting the erasure of indigenous histories and to honor Native communities by fighting truth and reconciliation. Following treaties between 1851 and 1855, Kalapuya people were dispossessed of their indigenous homeland by the United States government, forcibly removed to the Coast Reservation in Western Oregon. As we consider the impacts of colonization, we also acknowledge the strength and the resiliency of displaced indigenous people. The city of Eugene is built within the traditional homelands known as Kalapuya Ilahi. Kalapuya descendants are citizens of the Confederated Tribes Grand Ronde Community of Oregon, Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians, Oregon. They continue to make contributions to our communities here and across the lands. We express our respect for the inherent political sovereignty of all federally recognized tribal nations and indigenous people who live in the state of Oregon and across the nation. Therefore, the Planning Commission recognizes that what we do today will affect the many generations who will come after us.
Thank you, Commissioner Beeson, and thank you to everyone joining us in this hybrid meeting format. Today, our meeting will begin with public comment, followed by an informational work session on urban growth strategies actions to support middle housing. Anyone wishing to join the meeting online can do so by following the instructions listed on the agenda for this meeting. Planning Commission meetings can also be viewed by watching the live stream available on our website or the broadcast on Comcast Channel 21. For those who join the meeting via computer, device, or phone, your microphone, webcam, and phone are automatically muted when you enter the meeting as an attendee. If you wish to participate during the public comment portion of the meeting and haven't already done so, please raise your virtual hand now to join the speaker's queue in one of two ways. For those viewing the meeting on a computer, laptop, or other device, you can click once on the hand icon. For those listening to a meeting on the phone, you can press *9. Public comment is an opportunity for individuals to speak to the Planning Commission on any topics except for items scheduled for public hearing or public hearing items for which the record has already closed. As a reminder, your hand must be raised to be in the queue for public comment. Moderator, do we have any public comment? Do we have any? Okay, I was just going to ask if there are any planning commissioners joining virtually so I can keep an eye out. Looks like Commissioner Isaacson is here. As always, feel free to contact staff if there are comments that you are not able to provide or wish to get to us in a different manner. I'll now close public comment and move on to our next agenda item, which will be a work session on urban growth strategies actions to support middle housing. I'd like to turn it over to Heather O'Donnell to begin the staff presentation, following which the commission will have the opportunity to ask questions.
Thank you. Let's share my screen. Good evening, commissioners. Great. The captions on. So before we get into our agenda, we have a group of folks here tonight to discuss this topic. So myself, Heather O'Donnell, a senior planner in the planning division.
Jeff Cupper, principal planner in the planning division. Reed Verner, land use supervisor in the building and permit services division.
Lauren Summers, assistant city attorney. Great. And so Jeff and I will be doing the presentation, but we're all available for questions. So For tonight's meeting on removing barriers to middle housing, we'll start with a brief overview like we usually do of the 2026 adoption package and then and the project, Urban Growth Strategies project in general. And then Jeff and I will provide more details on the key middle housing code amendment concepts that we're bringing forward tonight. At the end of the presentation, we'll just have one slide on next steps, and then we'll identify some key concepts we're particularly interested in hearing feedback on, and then we'll move into questions and discussion for the majority of the meeting. So as a reminder, Urban Growth Strategies has 4 phases: community engagement, policy development, housing and jobs actions, and the land supply studies. And tonight we're talking about housing actions and specifically those related to middle housing. So this is attachment A in your packet, which has not changed since the last couple of times we provided it. It is the overall Urban Growth Strategies project timeline. So research and analysis and engagement have been underway for at least 2 years. We are about to begin the formal adoption process for the components that are ready to be adopted in 2026. And that's shown in the dark green bars as where adoption is anticipated for each component. The housing and jobs actions work are highlighted on the slide. And again, that's the focus tonight. This work will result in several different adoption type packages. Some of the efforts or actions that we have been looking at started moving forward in 2025. We are focusing now on the 2026 and 2027 adoption packages, which will have both policy and action components. And then after that, from 2028 to 2035, we will adopt and implement various actions in our 8-year housing production strategy. And then by 2030, we will bring any needed urban growth boundary expansion through the local adoption process. So again, focusing on the 2026 and 2027 packages of housing and jobs actions, they generally fall into 4 priority areas: increasing our capacity for housing and reducing regulatory barriers for both housing and jobs development, and encouraging compact development for both jobs and housing in and around centers. A summary of the 2026 and 2027 housing and jobs actions list is in the attachment B of your packet. That has been lightly updated from the last time you saw it. And again, today we'll be highlighting the middle housing code concepts that we're suggesting for 2026 adoption and that we want feedback on. So now I'm going to pass it to Jeff.
Awesome. Thanks, Heather. Again, Jeff Kepper, Principal Planner for the Planning Division. And this is firstly my first meeting in person with the Planning Commission since 2019, which is super exciting for me. And the last time I got to talk to the Planning Commission about middle housing was in 2022. So it's wild to be back here, but we're back here talking about more middle housing and thinking about ways to further reduce barriers to it and just think about middle housing in the context of some new rules as well. So first, just thinking about what is middle housing? Like, let's re-ground ourselves in that. I only made this presentation about 17,000 times at this point. So middle housing is really that space in between single unit dwellings and multi-unit dwellings like apartment buildings. It's that space in between. And that consists of anything from duplexes, triplexes, or fourplexes. That's 2 units on a lot, 3 units on a lot, 4 units on a lot. But also includes things like townhouses. Those are attached units that are all on their own individual pieces of property. And then you have cottage clusters, which is 4 or more kind of detached units on a property surrounding typically a common courtyard area. So, like I said, the last time we talked about this was really in 2022. While it feels like months, we're now years away from the original middle housing implementation. And so we've been hearing things, and we've been gathering some of that feedback, help from Reed, Heather and her team, as well as just what we kind of hear from the development community and others. So just to highlight a few of those things, one is one of those topics is building height. On the development community side and from architects, we hear that the height limitation in R1 of 30 feet, it makes it difficult to build a 3-story structure due to that limitation. And then on the other hand, from some of the neighbors, you hear people say that it feels out of character with the neighborhood sometimes because it feels very tall. So like I said, we've been hearing things on both sides of the table. So I'm only going to touch lightly on these because similar, it's, solar setbacks, folks have expressed that those are difficult standards to meet at times, and others feel like they're highly valued standards that they would like to see remain in place. Middle housing land divisions, this has been a really neat process to see evolve as a new type of land division, but has presented some unique barriers to that we didn't quite anticipate and that we've been working through and look forward to potentially streamlining some of that process. Other development standards that we've seen and identified as potential, barriers to middle housing development are things like our standards for accesses, driveways, spacing standards, some of the utility requirements, stormwater requirements, things of that nature. All of which, we'll do our best to identify ways in which those are being either streamlined or updated through this process. And then lastly, I do just want to touch on other feedback. This isn't the first time that we've talked about middle housing and gathered public comment on it. And throughout the original process, we heard a lot about the effects or perceived effects that it was going to have on neighborhood character, things of that nature. And we've continued to hear those sentiments expressed. And we expect those to continue to occur throughout this process. And so we want to just consider those and take those into consideration as we are continuing to move through this. And so with that kind of highlighted, I'll hand it back to Heather.
Okay, so that's kind of the previous code amendments and what we've been hearing. Now we're going to talk a little bit about how we got, building on that, how we got where we are with these concepts before you tonight. So similar to other key code concepts that we've been discussing with you over the last several months, these middle housing code concepts are the result of several factors. As we previously discussed, Eugene's projected housing needs from the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis, or the ONA, requires Eugene to almost double the amount of housing that's historically been produced in order to meet the need over the next 20 years. So because of that great need, we know we need to look for both big and small land use code amendments to reduce regulatory barriers and enable more housing. We again looked at what development standards have been the most frequently requested to be adjusted or for developers to receive relief from. We gathered ideas from city staff who have been reviewing building permits and land use applications. We heard from housing professionals and a stakeholder working group. Unique a little bit to the middle housing code amendments, there was legislation in 2025 that was specific to middle housing, and that is House Bill 2138. And that requires us to update our code, or we can make some amendments to our code to be in better alignment. Kind of a long slide. Doesn't look like it, but so the concepts we'll discuss tonight primarily reflect the top 2 bullets listed here. They reflect the specific requirements identified in House Bill 2138, which must be adopted by the end of the year. These required provisions are highlighted in yellow, like it is on this slide, on the following slides throughout this presentation. And then due to the short time frame for complying with House Bill 2138, these concepts lean heavily on the state's new model housing code for large cities, which was adopted in 2025, because it attempts to address the requirements of House Bill 2138. So it provides guidance for that. And you might be wondering why we're using the model code for large cities. Eugene meets the state's definition of a large city, which is any population over 25,000.
Oh.
So it's pretty good. However, a couple of notes about this newer model code. It is different than the middle housing specific model code that was referenced during the code update that Jeff was just talking about. First of all, the new model housing code, as the name implies, includes provisions for all housing types. So we used the model housing code we relied on that for the multi-unit concepts that we discussed with you in February. Second, the model housing code is optional and it's not required. The specific provisions in it are not required to be used as a baseline, which was more what the middle housing model code was required when we did that code update last time. That said, alignment with and I'm just trying to make sure I'm saying the right thing, the model housing code presumably provides clear and objective standards that we can use. It provides, again, guidance on how to implement House Bill 2138 in a short time frame. Most of the concepts that are listed in these slides reflect alignment with the model housing code. And so there's no indication on the slide like I did for what's yellow is required, but just know that. And if you have questions, we can cut back to that. Whereas we also looked at the climate friendly and equitable communities walkable design guidelines, and we looked at as I mentioned earlier, the adjustment review requests that we've received for opportunities that we could change the code to reduce those adjustment review requests. And so just as a reminder, what adjustment reviews are, they're a land use application process that allows for flexibility from what the specific standard states. But again, most of those require a land use process, which adds time, money, and uncertainty to the development process for everyone. So just looking for those opportunities. It's the same thing we did with the multi-unit design standards and the commercial zone standards that we brought to you. Co-concepts related to adjustment reviews or that are more staff-only suggestions are indicated with a staff recommendation footnote that you see on the slide there. There's only a few, and so I will try to remember to call those out. And then finally, as a reminder, so this is a little bit different from when we talked about the multi-unit design standards. In that case, we were talking about making the multi-unit design standards only applicable in residential zones. And there would be different standards for all development, including multi-unit and commercial zones. In this case, the middle housing standards would continue to apply in commercial and residential zones. So a little bit different than how we talked about things in February. So moving into the code concepts, again, you can follow along in more detail in attachment C. The concepts for updating the land use code definitions include the following. So kind of grouped these. We're looking at updating or adding some middle housing specific definitions. So this will include making it clear that duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, and cottage cluster dwelling types can all be attached or detached dwellings. That's something we already do in practice, but is required. Those are the definitions used in House Bill 2138. We would be adding a hard surfaced definition for the requirements for pedestrian connections in the middle housing code to make that more clear. And staff are recommending adding clarity regarding townhouses with a new townhouse site definition and updating the townhouse project definition. House Bill 2138 also requires the city to allow bonus units. And so we'll talk more about bonus units in a minute. But basically it requires the city to allow bonus units if the middle housing development includes accessible units like ADA units or affordable units. So affordable with a capital A. So they're income qualified units. Because of this, we need to add definitions for these types of units into our code and also rectify those new definitions with our other affordable housing terms that are already in the code, which could include removing or revising or some combination of the two related to those new definitions and the two that you see listed on the slide. And then there are some other definitions we think should be updated or added so they can continue to apply more broadly, not just to middle housing, but also to multi-unit and commercial. The goal is for consistent application of these definitions and how they are used. That way we're reviewing development the same across the spectrum. And so far, the definitions we've identified are building facade, street facing building facade, that would be new, window and door area, so kind of describing how window and door area measurements should occur, and a definition for main entrance. Okay, so moving into what I labeled here as the base zone requirements related to middle housing. And so what I mean by that, what I mean by base zone is standards for middle housing that are in the residential and commercial zone development standards. So they're not in the middle housing section of the code. The concepts listed here are all required under House Bill 2138. That's why they're highlighted in yellow. So allow an existing single unit or duplex that was legally established, such as prior to the date of these code amendments, to be retained as part of a new middle housing development, but still allow the new development to be reviewed under the middle housing standards. So kind of regardless of your total number of units, the new development is still under middle housing. Exempt these retained units from maximum density, just like new middle housing is exempt, and from the middle housing standards. So you don't have to retrofit your retained units. Allow the retained units to be on their own lot at the time of a middle housing land division. And then to that point, so the example shown here is the Grant Street Grow Homes. So on the top and kind of on the bottom, you can see the lavender house. That's an existing dwelling unit. And then on the bottom, you can see the bottom image, you can see the new units that are added to the back. So it's just an example of existing with new units and an existing unit that was retained with new units in the back.
All right. So next we're going to get into bonus units, which is something that Heather just touched on a little bit. But some of you may recall during the 2022 process, we actually incorporated into our code incentives for income qualified housing. And so if you look back at that, this is similar to, but going a little bit further than what that is. And this is actually a requirement of HB 2138, like we've talked about. And actually like I'll get into what it is, but like the city of Portland's actually implementing this now. This was something that people were looking into. Not everybody stepped all the way up to do this. We kind of met them right in the middle. So what is a bonus unit? Essentially imagine that you are gonna go out and you want to build a fourplex. And you say, you know what, I'm actually gonna have one of those units, I'm gonna have that be a capital A affordable unit. Or I'm gonna have that be an accessible unit, meaning it meets the American for Disabilities Act requirement or ADA requirements. If you do that, you get an extra unit. So you would go from a fourplex to 5 units. But we still, from the permitting perspective, would look at that and put you under the rules of a fourplex. And so all the same window coverage requirements, the allowance of where the fourplex can be located, the lot sizes and all that. A bonus unit is really allowing that opportunity to add additional units to a middle housing project if they are affordable or accessible, which is explicitly defined as mentioned, and making it easier to have those still fall under the allowances for middle housing. And so like I mentioned, you still review this all under the middle housing lens. And then additionally, there's requirements for there to be relief from some development standards. So for example, if you're going to go out and build a fourplex plus a bonus unit, it may be difficult to do that on a traditional lot due to things like height or lot coverage or certain standards. And so these bonus units, if you're going to do those, they're granted some relief to those standards based on where the concepts are based on the model housing code, kind of how they're approaching allowing bonus units. And so we figured there might be a lot of questions on these, but this is one tool to really try to incentivize those strictly affordable or accessible units. Yeah. All right. And moving on to some base zone development standards. So these are coming from the model housing code, and some of them are really just tackling our basic provisions. So something like building height. So like in R1, our building height limitation is 30 feet currently. And under this proposal, it would just raise that building height limit in R1 from 30 feet to 35 feet. And that's for all housing. So not just limiting that to middle housing, but under the current concept, that would be single unit dwellings as well, or any housing that gets built. The front yard setback for middle housing would be reduced from 10 feet to 5 feet. And the required outdoor area, which is something that's required in our higher density zones, R2, R3, and R4, that would be increased from 10% to 15% for triplexes, fourplexes, or townhouses. And like I said, these are a lot of these concepts are coming straight from the model housing code. And just as a note, one of the reasons why I wanted to highlight building height was, as a planning commission, you may remember that this was something that we talked about a lot. Building height and lot coverage were two hot topics. Building height in particular, the planning commission recommended 35 feet for middle housing, and the city council brought that down to 30 to kind of see how middle housing went as we went on. And so now we have the model housing code setting it out at 35 feet. And I'll hand it back to Heather.
Okay, so now moving into the part of the code that is specific to middle housing development standards. Starting with driveways, access, and vehicle use areas. Because the land use code prohibits vehicle use, access, maneuvering areas, garages in between the new middle housing dwellings and the street. We've seen adjustment requests in order to allow existing garages, existing parking areas, and existing driveways to be utilized. So this concept would allow these existing areas to be utilized, which would provide more flexibility and reduce costs by not having to alter those areas or get rid of them and build new. This concept is not in the model housing code, but you can see I have the little staff recommendation footnote there. For lots that are on more than one street, like a corner lot, this concept would clarify that vehicular access must come from the street with the lowest classification. So if, for instance, the lot is on both a local street and a collector street, access must be from the local street. This is consistent with another part of the Eugene Code, Chapter 7 for public improvements. And this is the same code concept we brought to you for multi-unit development and commercial zones. So just kind of making that all in alignment. This is also consistent with the model housing code, which is why it doesn't just say staff recommendation there. Okay. So moving on to entrances, windows, and doors. These concepts, again, are all from the model housing code and also align with the code concepts discussed for multi-unit and commercial zones. So for main entrances, requiring a main entrance to be within 8 feet of the front lot line, 8 feet of the front lot line, yeah. And adding minimum porch and patio dimensions for main entrances that are opening onto porches and patios. For windows, the current requirement in our code is for a minimum of 15% of windows and doors on each floor on all street-facing facades. And this concept would change the measurement to 15% of the entire facade, street-facing facade. And while that we do think that that increases the amount required. 15% of the whole facade results in more window coverage needed than 15% per floor, which is a little bit counterintuitive, but it kind of depends on the shape of your building facade. We're also proposing, or a concept we've from the model housing code is to require only 10% of the other street-facing facades instead of 15% on all street-facing facades. And we are looking at adding exceptions. So the exceptions to this requirement would be updated. There's already an exception for if there's a dwelling between the street-facing building facade and the street. You don't have to meet that windows and doors requirement. This would add another exception for if there is a buildable lot between the street-facing building facade and the street. So to visualize that, for example, this would help when middle housing is proposed on a flag lot that is located behind a vacant lot that's on the street. And so the idea there is that the vacant lot, the future development on the vacant lot would need to meet the street facing facade requirements, not the lot behind it. And those are all from the model housing code.
All right, townhouses. So again, townhouses are those attached units that are on their own individual lots. And, you know, these concepts that I'm going to talk about today, minus a couple noted on the screen there, are mostly from the model housing code. And then just as a note, like staff has identified a lot of like cleanup we can do within the code, but these are kind of the higher level concepts of things that are proposed to change. So the first is the maximum number of attached units. So that's literally like how many attached units can be in one single block. Currently in our code, that is 10, whereas the model housing code actually has that listed at 6. So for consistency, we would take it down to 6, but allow up to 10 to be attached if they include bonus units. So those are those affordable or accessible units. Access and driveways is another area where some changes are proposed, like reducing allowed driveway widths to limit that to 12 feet or 60% of the frontage, depending on whichever is less. Another thing would be limiting corner lots to access one street. This is both to be consistent with code, but also or consistent with the model housing code, but also our own code, Eugene code in different chapters requires developments to take access from lower classifications roads. And then also just clarify when a shared access is allowed versus required. And this is actually a staff recommendation because this has been a topic that's come up a number of times, is to really make it clear within our own code when access should be shared or when it is required to be shared. And finally, another item is, and some of you may remember this figure from the code, this is our townhouse unit features. And it used to be that townhouses had to include a combination of those unit features. And one of the things that came out through the model housing code is that they actually removed this requirement for unit features. And that was identified as kind of a effort to just continue to reduce barriers and also try to reduce cost to the development of housing. And there is upcoming rulemaking regarding limiting requirements to reduce housing costs. So this is kind of like right in line with that. The one thing I will note about this though is while unit features would not be required under this concept, the window requirements are still there. This doesn't include the window requirements that come with the all middle housing types except for duplexes. Then moving on to our wonderful cottage clusters, which we've got some awesome pictures of cottage clusters that have been developed around town. We've had a few. We would be under this changing the maximum number of units from 8 to 12, consistent with the model housing code. And then an interesting provision to wrap our heads around for a minute was changing the maximum unit footprint from 900 square feet to an option. So, the footprint of the cottages, it was said you had to have that be 900 feet or less, and you were limited in that way to try to manage the cottage scale of it. In the new model housing code, they've actually added some additional flexibility that says you can have a larger footprint if you have a shorter cottage. And so in the model housing code, it is said that if you have a 15-foot high or lower cottage, you can have a larger footprint. If you're going to have a taller cottage, you have to go back to that 900 square foot footprint. And so we're recommending the same proposal under this category as well. And then we've got a few more. So again, for the model housing code, a requirement for all cottages to connect the main entrance to the courtyard. Right now, this is there's just a kind of odd optional provision in the code that kind of forces you into this, but now it's just clear that all cottages must connect their main entrance to the courtyard. It provides an option of 50% of the main entrances facing a courtyard to be up to 20 feet away. And this is in response to the fact that just from a design standpoint, cottage clusters are often on tight sites. And this provision in particular, while in the model housing code, is something that we've actually heard and seen issues with under the current code. So this is really allowing main entrances to be more flexible with how those main entrances can orient to the common courtyard currently. And then another one, to require cottages on 2 sides of the courtyard. So that's just saying, if you have a common courtyard, you're required to have a common courtyard, and this is saying that at least on 2 sides of that common courtyard, you need to have cottages that are using that as to meet the requirements. And then finally, the parking area prohibition, which right now you are not allowed to have a parking area for cottage clusters within 10 feet of a street lot line. And this would expand that to say you can't have it within 20 feet of a street lot line. So it's kind of pushing that parking area back. And I think that's it for cottage cluster.
Yeah, okay, so a couple other things. Currently, middle housing is exempt from trash and recycling standards, and this is something we've heard some comments about. So this would add the screening requirements for all shared trash and recycling areas that are adjacent to other residential lots or the street, so within 20 feet. for all middle housing except duplexes. And the concept is from the model housing code. We'll have to look at how that works because we already have screening requirements for trash and recycling, but for other areas. Regarding Chapter 7, public improvements, which I mentioned earlier, we are coordinating with Public Works and building staff regarding issues we've heard where there is some overlap or connection between Chapter 7 requirements and Chapter 9 land use code. So generally, Chapter 9 is the private portion of the property. Chapter 7 is the public area, so this public sidewalk, the public street, that sort of thing. Similar to the concept earlier about allowing developments to use existing driveways, the first concept listed here would allow an existing access to be used under certain circumstances, rather than the applicant having to request an adjustment, which often gets approved anyway. So just trying to reduce the process there. And then for the last bullet, this concept is to align the triggers for meeting new access requirements, regardless of if the units are attached or detached. So just looking at the number of units, regardless of if they're attached or detached, requiring the same standards. So now talking about concepts not suggested at this time. So as I mentioned, almost all of the concepts here are in alignment with the model housing code for large cities. There are some provisions, and these are kind of the higher concept ones that we're not suggesting to include at this time. So the first two bullets are regarding density. Density exemption for conversions of units to other units, and requiring or having your density provisions be by housing type, so a specific density for each type of housing rather than for the zone in general. So we suggest holding off on adjusting the density provisions because we anticipate that we will need to review all of our density provisions, not just for middle housing, over the next year as part of the 2027 housing actions and adoption package, specifically due to responding to what our specific housing need is by housing types and plan designations, and what our land supply studies say. So that's why we suggest holding off on that. The model housing code also includes additional development standards for single unit and duplexes and updates to the accessory dwelling unit standards. And they're pretty similar to what you have already heard about. Some of those may add costs, like entrance transition requirements. Others would be allowing bonus units. Since we're not required to update the code by the end of the year for these other housing types like we are for under HB 2138, we're not proposing to make those changes at this time. The model housing code we're not suggesting it. The model housing code relies on a maximum floor area, which is the total amount of building square feet that you can have on the property. So if you add up your floors for all of your buildings. Eugene's land use code uses the maximum lot coverage that you can have. So it's like one plane versus multiple planes. And then also requires a minimum outdoor area. And together those kind of help regulate the extent of the development versus the floor area. They're similar concepts, not exactly the same. And they don't exactly result in the same outcomes. But we're not proposing to pivot at this time because of our short time frame. And then the last two bullets requiring main entrance standards like trees and short walls, which I just mentioned about not adding that to single unit or duplexes, and not requiring a specific type of pedestrian connection for all housing types. We're not proposing to add those. Again, just to keep some flexibility in how the applicant may reduce costs. And frankly, as far as these last two, some version of these are likely to be done anyway. So it doesn't seem like there's a need to add those at this time. And then I will switch to Jeff.
Yeah, and I will,
Oh, thanks.
no, middle housing land division is one of my favorite topics. And I mean that actually seriously. This is, just as a refresher, middle housing land divisions were a tool and companion piece to the original middle housing, House bill requirements. That came forward as a way to not only just say, hey, go develop more housing, but also grow home ownership opportunities beyond just creating more housing units. So middle housing land divisions are that tool that says, if you go build a fourplex on a lot, or if you want to have 4 units on a lot later, you can do a middle housing land division where each unit of middle housing gets to be owned separately by somebody who buys it in the future. That process has been really successful. We've seen a lot of people do that here in Eugene. But under HB 2138, there's been some required changes, many of which we are very supportive of, as we've seen the issue arise for ourselves. One of those is to allow retained units to exist on their own lot. So that's an example where, let's say you have a property, there's already a duplex on the front of the property, and you want to build one more house in the back of the lot to make it a triplex. You want to sell off that rear unit back there, but the duplex is stacked, which means that they can't be middle housing. You can't divide those through middle housing land division. This would allow you to say, hey, that duplex is already existing. That can stay on its own middle housing lot, remain a duplex there, and you can sell off that other part of your triplex. And so it allows you to, it really just expands the ways that middle housing land division can be used when there's already units on the land, which we think would be a big benefit. The other changes are clarifying requirements for separate wastewater and water utilities. And then a big kind of part of HB 2138 is requiring clarification and amendments to the actual process. And people are actually availing themselves of this process now. And what it does is it means that the decision when issued by the planning director is done at the final level. There's no local appeal process. It's good. If somebody wants to appeal it, it gets appealed straight to the Oregon Land Use Board of Appeals, or LUBA. Just kind of trying to streamline that appeals process, whereas under the current provisions, it goes to the hearings official first, and then would go to LUBA after that. And then finally, it's that only the applicant can make that appeal. So it removes the ability of other parties to appeal somebody else's middle housing land division. You're only allowed to appeal your own. Really, and I think that's largely recognizing that middle housing land divisions aren't creating development opportunities. They're just allowing people to divvy up the middle housing units that are already allowed to be there. And so with that, I'll hand it to Heather for next.
Yeah, okay, great. So next steps. So the 2026 adoption package received formal initiation from the City Council on November 24th of last year and the Board of Commissioners on December 2nd. So we just published a March project update, which included all of the code concepts that we've been bringing to you over the last few months. This concept included basically a PDF for each of the code concept areas, topic areas, and then also a feedback form and the email to send it to. This went in the March 8th Eugene Planning newsletter. It's on the Engage Eugene webpage, and we'll be circling back with topic working group folks to give them that information. We're asking for feedback from, oops, I put feedback form through March 27th. And then you know, again, this is kind of ahead of the formal process, which we anticipate sending the LCD notice in late spring to start the formal process, which would be initiating or getting ready for public hearings, public comment, that whole process with the goal of adoption for the 2026 package by the end of the year. We have a work session scheduled with City Council on the 2026 adoption package in April. And then again, while the 2026 adoption package formal process is going on, later this year, we'll be kind of going back and forth between the 2026 package and the 2027 package, because we'll be developing actions and bringing those to you for adoption in 2027. So there's going to be a little bit of leapfrogging going on. Okay, so key questions on some of these concepts before we head into questions and discussion. As I mentioned, we've got a couple areas that we'd be particularly interested in feedback on, though obviously we would be interested in any feedback you have on any of these concepts. So feedback on the concept of increasing the R1 building height from 30 to 35 feet in general, that concept, and then also thoughts on, is it for all housing, just middle housing, other ideas. Feedback on the concept of providing commensurate relief to certain development standards. That's the actual terminology used in House Bill 2138. To accommodate density provided by those bonus units. And so right now, what we've talked about is lot coverage, potentially building height. These are the things identified in the model housing code. Reducing cottage cluster courtyard requirement amounts. And then the other thing I forgot to put on here is allowing townhouses to, more townhouses to be attached if you're doing the bonus units than would otherwise be allowed. And then kind of the catch-all, is there anything that you didn't hear discussed that you would like to hear about or thoughts you have, and anything that you think should be considered for inclusion? So that was a lot. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Heather and Jeff. Commissioner Edwards, want to start us off?
Thank you. Well, it's more of a question. Thank you guys. This is great. I actually remembered this bill like vaguely, and I looked it up and I thought, oh, I had testimony in support of it. So always nice to see how it, you know, kind of plays out. My question is really more about what the city has at its discretion to be able to, because I know that when middle housing first came down, it was really difficult to communicate to the community that there are certain things that the state is requiring us to do. And then there are certain things that we could kind of, customize to our own community. And I think I'm already hearing from some of our members. I got an email earlier this week and I actually responded with, we're having a work session on this in planning commission, so let me kind of understand and get my bearings and try to kind of, parse this out a bit. But I think it's always hard to figure out what, and I'm curious as in your role as staff, I mean, are there those distinctions that you're able to make in this process? Because I know when this goes to council, they're also going to hear from community that likes some things, doesn't like things. And I just want to know, like, how much of this is even up for discussion as far as like what is required.
Yeah, I can start. So what is absolutely required is everything that was in yellow, those yellow highlights. So allowing the bonus units, allowing the retained units, addressing the fact that, and this is where the model code comes in, but trying to provide that relief from development standards to accommodate the bonus units. Why, the types of housing, like the qualifying types of housing to get you the bonus units, The number of bonus units, those are all in HB 2138. The land division requirements that Jeff was talking about, everything else mostly, those things are are addressed in the model housing code, and everything else that was pretty much, that was not colored, not highlighted, is just from the model housing code and is, you know, an indicator of how to address the requirements, not only in HB 2138, but climate friendly areas for walkability, those kinds of things. So it's definitely a may. We don't have to use the model housing code. Yeah.
Okay.
It's a little bit, Commissioner Edwards, like the way we used the middle housing model code last time around, where we had a set of requirements that we had to meet, and you could rely on the model code to meet those requirements. Or the city could try to kind of craft its own code provisions to meet those requirements. If you rely on the model code, it's a pretty good bet that at least the Department of Land Conservation and Development, who adopted and developed the model code, would agree that they meet the legal standards that you're trying to meet. If you craft your own, there's a little bit more risk, but there's a little bit more flexibility in terms of tailoring it to Eugene. So it's a risk reward calculation. So that the yellow highlights are the legal criteria that we need to meet. There is a little bit of flexibility in terms of how they are met, but there is some safety in using the model code to meet those requirements.
Yeah.
And we can try to, as we kind of continue to go through the iterations of code adoption, be clear about what is truly a requirement, what is a proposal to meet that requirement, and where there's flexibility to make changes.
That's helpful. I think I think the experience we had with the middle housing, original, I think in retrospect, just given the years of litigation that we had to endure in order to, I think sometimes just relying on kind of meeting the requirements. And I mean, I sensed from council after all of that really was the appetite that they tended to land on. And so I'd be curious to see, kind of how their conversation goes with how far we might go to meet certain requirements, and what are the options to meet certain requirements. As somebody who doesn't work in the code every day, I know it's not something that I do. It's always difficult because I'm looking at some of these scenarios, even talking about the window coverage. It's like, what does that look like? Like, to me, I'm a visual person. And so seeing, here's what it is now, here's how it would be changed or could be changed. And this is the requirement that it's intended to meet. Distances from the drive or the parking areas from the arterials. I'm trying to figure out what would be the rationale. Like, to me, that's the pieces that as a layperson, I struggle with just a little bit, just trying to figure out, well, because there's always these unintended consequences, and that's sort of when you start hearing from the community, and well, that didn't work very well. So it's mostly just feedback and just basic question, but I just thought I'd start with asking that. So yeah, but thank you.
I was going to jump in, and then I saw Commissioner Isaacson set it up for a little bit. I had a couple of questions. I know you asked for some specific feedback on those items, and I think that the 35-foot limit makes a lot of sense. It's pretty tough to get 3 floors in to 30 feet. Some of the questions I had were a little bit more nitpicky. For example, on the townhouses, do we need to reduce the max attached units from 10 to 6 according to the model code, or is that more of a suggestion?
That was baked in there based on consistency with that model code. So that's a good example, I believe, of one of those options where we would, if you wanted to keep it at 10 where it currently is, I think that would remain an option.
Yeah, I guess I just don't see, I mean, even with the potential for bonus units, why restrict housing density if kind of we're rolling in the opposite direction? It's really challenging, I think, to build affordable units when it's like a homeowner or a lot owner on middle housing. A developer might be a different story, but those are also kind of tough to make pencil at smaller scale. So I don't know if that's going to be like a widely utilized option, even though there are some cool projects, that are underway or that have been built that are affordable.
I will just jump in there too, affordable or accessible. So
What's the definition? Is it fully accessible type A, type B?
it's type A, I believe, yeah.
Okay,
Mhm.
gotcha. And then was also curious about, whether the maximum unit size could be increased to 1,400 square feet for all types of cottages. 900 is a little bit tighter, but you get a lot more options, especially for manufacturers and stuff once you get up to that 1,100, 1,200. So I think it can make a lot of difference in terms of especially allowing families to have access to those. And then also just had the question about why pushing the parking area back to, seems like make it a little harder to provide parking for cottage clusters. Is that kind of more of an environmental goal or?
Mhm.
We can try to dive into why the state proposed that as an expanded area. Like I said, that in that case, that was just a reflection of consistency with the model code. And that we're happy with it.
Yeah, and I
Should remember.
Well, I think it also aligns with the walkable, the climate friendly.
Yeah.
And equitable communities, walkable design standards. But we can follow up on that. So I think that's where it's coming from, is trying to reduce the, generally for development, trying to put more of the parking behind and bring the structures up closer to reduce the make it more walkable friendly, reduce the potential conflicts between cars and pedestrians.
Yeah, and I guess it just all goes to the idea, all those questions about just providing as much flexibility as possible. I think the biggest challenge with the infill housing, the middle housing, is that, at least in our community, it's still terribly expensive to build. And so it remains a project that's not, at least doesn't make it as much economic sense as it may make maybe social sense or kind of long-term investment sense for a lot of people. So some of those things seem like they could make pretty big difference in terms of what makes it viable to build on the lot. And I'll pass it on to Commissioner Isaacson.
Hi, sorry, I'm still working on a pretty decent cold, so I'm gonna keep my camera off. I wrote down my questions because my voice is kind of coming in and out. Hopefully you can hear me. One element that stood out to me in the college cluster updates is the strengthening of the courtyard relationship, requiring clusters to be about the courtyard that connects and enhances it. It seems like that's a kind of shared space that naturally supports community connection and neighborhood interaction goals that we were just talking about with Envision Eugene. And I was wondering if that was part of the thinking or just happened to be coincidence, or whether that was maybe it's in part of the state mandate.
It's in the model housing code, that requirement. I think generally the model housing code approach does strengthen the connections in general to the courtyard.
Awesome, thank you. And I was wondering, we were just talking about how there were, and I want to get the terminology correct here, the ability to, let me scroll up here, allow retained units for some of the properties. I was wondering if that extends out, or if there's any plan to extend it out on the cottage clusters from when we go from 8 to 12. In other words, if you have a property that's big enough, you could have 12 cottage clusters. Are those going to be at some point individually able to be sold so people can own their own home, or is this going to have to be more of an investment opportunity for people to expand kind of their portfolio?
Thanks for the question. Yeah, so middle housing land divisions currently are available to cottage clusters. And so under the new provisions regarding retained units, if you had, say, a single unit dwelling up at the front of the property and you wanted to keep that and then get the cottages on their own lots, you'd be able to do it that way. Currently, and Heather, correct me if I'm wrong on this, currently the way that we've drafted the concept is that would be available to any retained units that are middle housing. So it's like if there was a duplex on the front and you wanted to put a cottage cluster in the back, you'd be able to also put that duplex on its own lot. And have that be sold off as a duplex, and have the rest of it be a cottage cluster. Again, relying on those retained unit requirements. Is that correct? That's what we wrote it.
Yeah, the House bill requires us to allow it for 1 unit and duplexes, and we added.
We just said middle housing generally. If it's retained middle housing, then you can have add additional things like a cottage cluster to the back and have that be there.
Is there any thought or plan to extend it out more broadly? The reason I ask is if we're trying to increase home ownership and increase people having access, the ability of people to buy a small home that would be a cottage cluster, as opposed to 3 or 4 of them in a portfolio, is going to be broader, right? I don't know if that is something that's being considered, or if that's just not in the cards for right now.
Commissioner Isaacson, people already can buy a single cottage and a cottage cluster, and that will continue to be true after these amendments.
Okay. And then the last question I had was, if we adopted all of these proposed changes tomorrow, now that we're several years in on middle housing, what are some of the biggest challenges that you believe are a barrier to middle housing production?
That's an interesting question. You can see all of our wheels turning.
We can see.
I can hear it in the pause.
Let me just go back to the notes really quick to make sure I think about this is conjecture on just my anecdotal experience. We've also heard similar things to this, but I wouldn't necessarily say it's exactly one development standard or another. I would say it's usually a combination of those factors, whether that's an access connection that requires an adjustment, plus having to separate the utilities. Those things combined are oftentimes, so it's just providing that clarity in the code and removing as many barriers as we can within the development code is probably the factor that weighs most heavily. Reid, do you have any thoughts on that as well?
Yeah, the one that the issue that comes up that we hear from people is uncertainty a lot. So when we passed our version of the model code, we were remanded, we moved to in the middle housing code, we moved to the state's model code and then back twice. That created a lot of uncertainty with developers because they didn't know what standards to be designing for. So they kind of had to be ready to pivot as they were planning their projects. So I think like as we're adapting our code standards, kind of finding a solution that is going to meet the state's model code requirements so that we can kind of get in that groove and have consistent requirements that are going to be protected from any challenges that they're not clear and objective, or challenges that they don't comply with the state codes, so that we can kind of have consistent code standards that developers can continue to rely on when they're building out their projects. I think that would be one barrier that we could remove if we're kind of thinking ahead of how we do these changes and making sure that we're picking changes that matches what the state wants us to be doing.
Commissioner Bailey?
Thank you.
I have a lot of kind of little questions like you did. But first, Jeff, I wonder if increasing height from 30 to 35, does that address the concerns of the developers you've spoken to who wanted to see a height increase? Or are they looking for more? Or, I mean,
during the previous process that we went through, what we heard from most architects and folks who build these things during that process was basically saying, once you add the space in between a floor plus the space you actually need to live, all of a sudden it was causing everybody to basically design a 3-story structure with a flat roof, which in Oregon is not exactly always an ideal scenario when there's a lot of rain. And so that additional 5 feet offered enough flexibility to make designs a little more feasible for the actual construction of the housing.
so you think that'll be sufficient? That's our feeling.
Based on the
this time.
feedback that we received previously, that would be sufficient in that case.
All right, and I'm in favor of that. I also agree with not reducing the number of townhomes from 10 to 6. And I have questions about windows and doors. I wonder what was behind the requirement to begin with and why it's only on the building facade. Because I've done a lot of work with fenestration and 15% is very low. So why do we have a requirement at all? What's it about?
Yeah. I'm trying not to put words in the mouth of the state who originally required that. I can say that within our own multi-unit standards, which already existed and required windows. It's about having that presence facing the street, right? So that it's not just a blank wall. And I would surmise that the state was kind of viewing that in the same way, that it's about providing some presence, some feeling of life within the structures so that you don't end up with just a big blank wall facing the road.
Okay.
And so it's about that urban form, I think.
Eyes on the street, yeah.
Do we have anywhere, any requirements with regard to allowing light? Any building fenestration requirements?
The only requirements we have on light are as our solar requirements. And so those are solar setbacks, which essentially means in certain cases where your lots are oriented in a certain way, kind of looking sun coming from the south, your building is prohibited from providing shade onto other structures. And so you get additional setbacks to ensure that they have access, solar access to that. And so those still apply to all buildings.
And multi-unit and commercial require a minimum percentage of windows.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I would like to hear how you define cottage, because it seems to me that it's anything that's not a single family home on an individual lot. Now, if it's multi-units, we're calling them cottages. Is there any other distinction?
We can read it.
Sure.
So right now, dwelling, so we have dwellings listed in the code, and then dwelling, comma, cottage cluster right now is a grouping of no fewer than 4 detached dwellings per acre with a footprint of less than 900 square feet each that includes a common courtyard. Cottage clusters are not fourplexes or multi-unit dwelling. And so that's one of the definitions that we would need to update to say that it's dwellings that are detached or detached. Yeah.
Okay. Well, as far as I'm concerned, it's still a bunch of homes on in one lot, right?
Around a courtyard.
Yeah.
Yeah, and with the footprint requirement.
Yeah. And they're individual homes. Okay. That's it. Thank you.
Commissioner Beeson?
Broadly speaking, I think all of this is great. I'm kind of on the same theme I've been on the last several meetings as we've gone through this material. I think everything that's coming together here really helps form a foundation for us as a community going forward next 10, 15, 20 years to be able to try to add housing and do it in a flexible way, do it in a way that allows it to be built so we can meet the needs all the way through here, all of it. I definitely agree with the 30 to 35 feet. And I think 2 things about that. I mean, when I thought about it over, since we did it during middle housing, we had all that discussion. The idea across the entire R1 zone of adding an additional 5 feet of capability for construction adds this capacity, I guess for lack of a better word, capacity across the entire community for what I think would end up being more cost-effective, efficient housing. Now, it would take decades to play out or to work out. But I just think it's a tremendously kind of cost-effective thing for a community to do. The detailed comment, I remember a bunch of discussion at that time around, you were talking a little bit about the distance between floors and all of that. 30 feet was definitely not, I didn't think it was enough to get 3 stories in of what I'd call livable space. And there may be different definitions when you talk about the height from the surface, from the floor up to the ceiling. But when I think about a normal kind of a place where people can live and be comfortable, it seems like you need more than that to get 3 stories. And I guess my comment would be that as we go along, and maybe you've done this, but there'd be some really detailed discussions with architects or with builders and really get into that and be sure we don't need 36 or, you know, I mean, kind of what people think if you're really, we're going to push that forward in the community and talk about it, that we get it right. And 35 feet may be the number. It's just kind of convenient that we're doing it in 5-foot increments. So that's a comment. I also, I guess, kind of just a general question. I had the same thought about the townhouses. We were going from 10 to 6, and then you can go back to 10 if you do some affordable, and you get 4 bonus units. And I asked about bonus units last time, and I'm still probably going to take a couple of months to get it through my head. But when I'm thinking about it now, as you guys talk about bonus units and I read all this material, it really seems to have to do with, maybe this is obvious, has to do with affordable units. So we can say, yeah, we're going to let you build 6 townhouses under this rule if it passed. And if you add some affordable units, we'll let you go to 10. And that kind of threads through a number of different places in here. You can have additional units. You might be doing a triplex, but you could do a quad if you had one more that was affordable. However it is that it's all worded. And I haven't quite figured this all out yet. I just want to kind of throw it out. We have such an, I'm going to be hyperbolic here a little bit. We have such an overwhelming shortage of housing in our community and in the state. I find myself thinking, whenever I think about this bonus thing, I sort of feel like we should enable developers, builders, and owners, and so on, to build, I guess, as much housing as we can under this code as we put it together, with the idea that we right now in 2025 to 2030 are in a kind of a situation that we have just never been in. And it's going to take an incredible amount to get out of it. So I don't know, you know, I'm just kind of thinking the idea of bonus units to do affordable makes sense. I think we should be trying to enable as many units as we can. Comment, that's a comment.
And the one thing I do want to stress too is that, you know, staff are here as a resource, and this is extremely nuanced and extremely, like, I don't want to, you know, these are lifted up higher level concepts, but as we work through this process, I just want to encourage you all to, like, if you do have a question, reach out to staff. We're happy to clarify or walk you through the thinking on things. Or it might be something that we say, oh, that'd be really great for everyone to know. Let's make sure we bring that back to the whole group. So really appreciate those comments, and it helps us kind of navigate a lot of these topics moving forward and just the lens that we should be looking at.
I had another question for you. I know you had this all the way at the end, but you couldn't dangle this without getting a little bit of excitement. So it mentions a code concept not proposed at this time, which would be requiring density by housing type rather than zone. You know, I could see that being a fairly controversial proposition in our community. But I mean, definitely a very bold idea. It seems like they would have the potential to significantly change the amount of housing that could be built in certain areas. So I'm just curious to hear more about that. Is there any possibility of exploring that sooner rather than later? Is that something that's coming in the state code? Maybe you could just educate me a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, that's how it is in the model housing code. It is, basically each housing type has its own set of standards, including the density that is targeted for that, the average density targeted for that housing type. I guess what I would say is that there are things we would need to look at, like ease of implementation, what happens when you have a development that has a development site that has multiple housing types. I mean, you really, even with these code amendments, you start to look at it and go, what is the difference, like with the bonus units? So a triplex can add a bonus unit, it becomes 4 units, but it's not a fourplex, it's a triplex, right? And so it's starting to like blend together. So in a way, it honestly makes an argument for just having housing densities by zoning, because it's just like, do your housing and meet this density, instead of like having these specific requirements for each housing type. So that would be kind of the argument for keeping our code the way it is. And I understand that there have been some discussions about whether or not there could be an allowance in the state rules that make it clear that you could continue to do housing by density by zone, rather, and these provisions would have to change a little bit to make that more clear, but just allowing that as an alternative path. So I'm not really answering your question other than to say like that's kind of the other side of keeping the density the way that it is. And I don't know.
Can I add on to that question? How is all this going to play out when you're doing the capacity analyses later in the year? I mean, isn't density going to be a factor? Because that,
yeah.
So we're going to have an answer to the question sooner rather than later.
Well, so when we do the land supply studies and we're trying to forecast how much future development capacity there is, the first thing we do is we look back at recent past development trends. So past growth monitoring data from our past building permits. And we are gathering density by housing type. But then you have to think about like, you would then have to forecast the future capacity by housing type on land.
Yeah.
Instead of bringing it up a level, which is the way we have traditionally done it, and I think is the same for most cities, which is forecasting development at an average density by plan designation. And then you're not trying to get, what the plan designation is of the property, and historically what your average density is by land designation. And so that's a much easier projection to make than trying to say, okay, this is low density residential, and how much do I think is going to be townhouses versus cottage clusters versus, getting into that level of precision is challenging.
I wonder how useful it will be.
Yeah, I mean, I think right now we are proposing to project housing capacity at average densities by plan designation, which is what we've done in the past, and continue that forward.
Did a thing to add on density. Maybe Jeff can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe with exceptions of townhomes, that all the other middle housing types are typically exempted from the maximum density in our code. So that was kind of built in when we initially did middle housing. So we're not really seeing the maximum density as being an issue in most middle housing projects currently.
Yeah, I think that's correct. And right now it's built in a really quite simple way where it just says, my lot is 44,500 square feet. I'm allowed to do a duplex, triplex, or fourplex, or cottage cluster. oh, I have a 3,000 square foot lot, what can I do with that? Oh, I can do a duplex or a triplex, you know, it's like very just kind of like direct. And so I think from an implementation standpoint, I'll be curious once we get into the studies kind of next year if maybe a different option does present itself. But right now, from an implementation standpoint, that seems to be pretty, speaking of ease of implementation, that's like people get that. So,
Okay. Any other questions from commissioners tonight? Anything else you all wanted to cover as part of this presentation?
Thank you all. Thank you for your work.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much.
I just wanted to say, I want to echo a lot of the things that have been said. I know that I kind of I didn't give you the feedback exactly what you were looking for, but I would, my feedback would be consistent with what I'm hearing from everyone else, that yes, on the heights, and to Commissioner Beeson's point, I think we need to do everything we can within reason, to knowing that this happens incrementally. It's not an overnight thing. I know people fear that, and especially when suddenly it's their backyard, when, all of a sudden a 35-foot fourplex, and, it's like, I know, but I do think that, that the need is, and this sentiment is really strong in the community, and I think people are starting to actually repeat it back, that even folks who aren't experiencing any kind of housing insecurity themselves, they acknowledge and will say, gosh, we have a housing crisis, and there's a lot more willingness to everybody do their own part. So I do think that I'm hoping that the pushback from the public is a little bit less than the before. I'm hoping that people are starting to kind of adjust to a new way of building our communities, and especially when they see these like beautiful, well-designed, nice buildings, and that bring social elements to the community. And I think it's really helpful. And I think I came from a community that had a lot of development really quickly, and it just became everyone was used to it, to the point where it's like, oh, something's coming in. What is it? What's that going to be? And I think that the more we do that, I think the more the community will start to just embrace the change and see the benefits. So.
And Commissioner Isaacson?
Yeah, I just want to echo that as well. I think that, when we started back with HB 2001, there's a lot of acrimony and a lot of, fear about what this is going to bring. And I think that the city's kind of proved, and through its staff, and that's a huge amount of thanks and accolades. You guys should be patting yourselves on the back about always looking to expand the pie and look beyond outside the circle, and how we take what is being asked of us and tailor it to Eugene's needs to try to hit that insanely large number of housing that we need. And that you should be proud of every time there's a new family that's being moved into a new housing as a result of the actions that you guys take place. I think that you should be proud of that. And that's why I asked that question previously, is as we look at expanding the pie further, if there are things that we can do that other communities have done, or if we want to reinvent the wheel a little bit to make it easier for folks. I think we've proven that the sky has not fallen, and that more density hasn't led to some of our worst fears, but there are still challenges that we're facing, and that everything we can do to bridge the needs of the community, as well as what our capacities are and know what our limits are. Then I think that's how we're going to get to whatever the number is of the housing units that we actually end up building. So thank you very much.
Next on our agenda is items from commission and staff. Are there any items or info to share from planning commissioners? Staff, checking with you first, Terry.
Yeah, thanks. Just kind of the rundown of your next meetings that you have on tap. So we didn't have any agenda items for March 24th, so we canceled that meeting, and it's during spring break as well. So some folks are off doing other things. We may have some follow-up items to bring you back in April, but no land use items that need to be scheduled. We've got a pretty clear schedule right now while we're pulling things together, as Heather was saying, for the upcoming formal adoption process for the urban growth strategies work. The other, I think this has been removed from your schedule, but the joint public hearing on the Goshen wastewater expansion was postponed by the county. That was their application. And they needed some more time, so they postponed that. And we don't have a new date yet. So nothing really on your calendar for April at this point. Then the council update, as Heather mentioned, there is a work session on the calendar for urban growth strategies in April.
When?
The 15th is that work session date. And last night at council, the direction was given to schedule a couple of second public hearings for the East Campus Plan amendments and the public health standards. So those will be both on April 20th at council. That's all I have.
Thank you so much. Any other items from staff? Appreciate everyone's participation tonight. This meeting of the Planning Commission is now adjourned.
Thank you.